what I was trying to do last week was lay a foundation for you, a contrast between missionary established churches, which really look and feel very, very Western, let's say, and the African indigenous churches, which are really quite different. I hope that was established last week. I bumped into the African independent churches kind of by accident, because I was asking my students about their churches and my fellow staff members, and they told me about their church. And I said, I'd like to go sometime. So they very generously invited me to attend. This is my student Solomon on the left and my friend Joshua on the right. Also, Willis and Solomon were good friends, and Roger Blewild was another student. They invited me. And I actually ended up preaching at least once in these independent churches. And I went to quite a variety of them and saw a variety of activities that we're going to talk about today, and not just talk about them, show you. And again, this was Joshua's father on the left, Bishop Marimudze. He and his wife, just a part-time gig, a side hustle they had, making dolls like this. And I thought I'd just bring them to show you. So these churches are often outdoors, not always, but usually they're outdoors. They're very energetic. And you can see that right there. Last week, we talked about the name Zion in these churches. It's very common. It's a big family of churches called Zionist churches. And this is where we're picking up the story this week. There was a question like, why Zion? And I said in my teaser last week, it has to do not with Zion in Jerusalem or the Bible, but Zion, Illinois, in Lake County, which you could ride a bike to today. Well, if you're a good biker. Here's Bishop Marimudze again, blessing worshipers. Remember, healing is a very important aspect of African traditional religion, pre-Christian, and you see a lot of that in the independent churches. Healing and blessing, and dealing with traditional, what we call pastoral problems, that has to do with witchcraft and veneration of ancestors. We'll talk more about that today. There's Bishop Marimudze again on the left. Some of the women in this church. Another church I visited, the Apostolic Church. And there's blessing again on the left, blessing and healing on the left. And at the end of the service, they faced east toward Jerusalem and said the Lord's Prayer. You can tell it's east because the shadows are in their backs. It's late afternoon. So we're going to pick it up at Zion, Illinois. This is the founder of Zion, Illinois. I didn't know that Zion, Illinois had this background. Does anyone else know about this?
I looked it up because you said to do it.
You looked it up?
The flat earth people.
Yeah, they later embraced flat earth philosophy. I read that. So this is the founder of Zion, Illinois. He called himself Manifestation of the Prophet Elijah, or sometimes he just called himself the Prophet Elijah. John Dowie died in 1907. His founding of Zion was obviously before that, but not much before that, early 1900s. And he called his church the Christian Catholic Church in Zion. Remember, Catholic also means universal, it doesn't mean just the Pope and so on. So problems developed, as they often do in a one-person show. He ran off the rails in terms of his cognitive functioning and also his accumulation of wealth. Does this sound familiar? So he died, his family left him. He died a rich but isolated man in 1908. But just before, it says 1908, and below that it says 1907. Well, take your pick. Around then. But before then, he had sent a missionary colleague to South Africa. This is the tie. But here's the newspaper clippings of his death. Prophet Dowie dead. Apostle Dowie is dead in Zion. after a long, he called his headquarters Shiloh. And apparently the Shiloh building is still there. We should do a field trip to Zion and see that. And he's buried in a cemetery in Zion. But this name, all the Zion churches in South Africa and Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Eswatini, Lesotho, Botswana, all those countries in Southern Africa, they're all derived from Dowie's church.
Wow.
This is from Wikipedia, which I know is not supposed to be a great source, but I did it. Sorry.
It's a good starting point.
Good starting point. Just this paragraph at the top. After Bryant left, Bryant was the missionary that Dowie sent to South Africa to establish the Zion Church. So after Bryant left, and that was Bryant, let's see. Sorry, I thought I had this all. I don't mention, oh yeah, there it is. Okay, Dowie died in 1907, but from 1904 to 1908, he sent Daniel Bryant, his colleague, to found branches of the Zion Church in South Africa. That's it. Sorry, I knew it.
Why South Africa?
I don't know why South Africa. Good question. There was an Afrikaans Dutch Reformed person there who was sympathetic with Bryant and Dowie, and perhaps that was the reason. So after Bryant left in 1908, the Zion Church proliferated into many sub-denominations of Zionist churches, all claiming their origin in Zion, Illinois. Together, Zionist churches constitute the largest group of Christians in South Africa.
Still today?
Yes, that's the statement about today. This is why learning about the African initiated churches is so important. They are really eclipsing the more staid, Western-oriented, more middle class aspiring churches like the Anglicans, Methodist Congregational, and so on. They're really eclipsing. Yes.
It's kind of funny because growing up, there were some Black churches. There was one church called Zion Temple.
Yeah.
It was a Baptist church, and then there was a Shiloh Baptist church too. So it's
Yes.
funny that they use those names.
I don't know if they're connected to Dowie or not. Probably not. I mean, Dowie's philosophies were pretty much all about Dowie.
But those names are from
Yeah, the names. Well, they're biblical names,
Mhm.
right? Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Something else I wanted to say about that. Oh, so the reason why the Zionist churches in Southern Africa qualify for African independent churches is they're not exactly independent, but because of Dowie's downfall and the scandal about his death and his ethical lapses and Bryant's early departure, they really severed ties with Dowie and Bryant at that point. So they're not exactly fully independent, but their connection with more established churches in the United States was very brief, just a 4 or 5 year, as opposed to the United Church of Christ in Zimbabwe, which is still closely related to the United Church of Christ USA. And the Methodist Church in Zimbabwe is part of the United Methodist Church in the United States. It's part, organically, the same church. When they have national meetings, they send delegates from Zimbabwe and from other United Methodist churches. I mean, it's still one church. They never really gave independence.
But the Methodists have split.
Yes, and they're split in part because the United Methodist churches in the Philippines, in South America, in Europe, in Asia, other places in Asia, they tend to be more conservative on issues of human sexuality. So they tend to vote with United Methodists in more conservative areas in the United States, forming a majority, or at least a big enough majority against more liberal United Methodists. So that part of their global, it's nice to be a global church, but also cultural issues, ethical issues enter in and tend to split the church. Whereas other mainline churches in the United States on the issue of human sexuality have generally become more and more liberal, tolerant, and accepting LGBTQ issues.
Except the Lutherans. The Lutherans.
No, the ELCA has come right along. and is fully embracing now. The Missouri Synod, or some call it the Misery Synod, and the Wisconsin Synod are far more conservative. So here are some reasons why the Zionist movement from Zion, Illinois, would have spoken to the heart and the soul of Christians and non-Christians in Southern Africa. Because Dowie had a big emphasis on faith healing. Healing always speaks to the religious sensibilities of Africans. If a church doesn't speak to healing, then it's not going to be successful in Africa. Now, I said last week how the missionary church spoke about healing. How was that? In what way did the missionary church encourage the ministry of healing in Zimbabwe?
Building hospitals.
Through hospitals and Western medicine. So that was the way Western churches made that connection. The Zionist churches and other independent churches, it's much more supernatural, if you want to call it that, faith healing. What we also today might be calling complementary or alternative medicine. Things that are a little different from going to see the doctor and getting a pill or surgery. Things like chiropractic medicine and so on, and other forms of healing. Well, Dowie was very big into faith healing. This spoke to the Christians and non-Christians in South Africa. Also, this next group of items here at the bottom is about how the African initiated churches always draw a close parallel between themselves and their experience and the Israelites in the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament. Dowie also did that. He wore, remember the robe that he wore? He kind of fashioned himself as a new Elijah or Elijah, sort of bringing the Old Testament into today. And here are some ways that the Zionist churches and other African independent churches draw upon the Hebrew Bible in their own practices. They generally look at the Old Testament as a reliable source of ethical guidance. So issues of separating women at the time of menstruation, separating the women from the worshiping circle is practiced in some independent churches as it is in some forms of Judaism. Circumcision, dietary restrictions against shellfish and pork, what are some of the other kosher laws? Keeping
Meat and cheese.
Yes, keep meat and cheese.
Dairy.
Dairy and
Life and death have to be on different plates, I guess.
life and death are in different places.
Dairy is life, meat is death.
I've never heard of it. I like that.
Wow. Remind.
And the Hebrew Bible, many of the great heroes of the Hebrew Bible were polygamous men. Right? Polygamy runs very deep in the culture of Africa, all throughout Africa, pre-Christian and post-Christian, pre-independence and colonial days and post-colonial days. We talked about that last week. And basically, polygamists can say, if it's good enough for Abraham, it's good enough for me. And so a lot of the African independent churches practice polygamy. The Saturday Sabbath, again, Jesus? What was the Sabbath for Jesus? Was it Sunday? For Jesus, Sabbath was the Jewish Sabbath. Friday night sundown to Saturday sundown. So the independent churches usually, but not always, practice Saturday Sabbath. The Hebraic clothing that Dowie wore is part and parcel of the clothing that's worn in all the African initiated churches. Prophets, dreams, and visions, all throughout the Hebrew Bible, very important means of divine communication, revelation, right? This is emphasized in Dowie's church, and it really spoke to African soul. And the identification with the Exodus. We are the new Israel is something you hear a lot in the African independent churches. Jesus is the new Moses. And this is not contrary to the New Testament. The whole book of Matthew is built on the kind of vision of Jesus as the new Moses, the lawgiver, a different kind of law, a new interpretation of the law, but nonetheless a law, just like Moses. So this just spoke very deeply, and that's why Zionist churches were so successful in Southern Africa. Philip Jenkins is one of my sources in this research. Here are 3 things he says about this deep tie between the Hebrew Bible and what's viewed as Hebraic customs, beliefs, and the independent churches. Modern African Christians readily claim direct continuities from Judaism. Preaching on the book of Esther, one Zimbabwean pastor assures his congregation God is on the side of Jews. As long as you are of Jewish origin, that is of Christian background, no one will touch you. Witches will come, but they won't touch you. Are Christians is part of our spiritual lineage from Judaism? Of course, right? This is not new. This is not unorthodox in any way. It's just really emphasized strongly in the African instituted churches. Jenkins also says one Hebraic-oriented movement is the Nazarite Church, the followers of Isaiah Shembe. Among the Zulu people of South Africa, the Shembe Church reestablished the Sabbath as the holy day, meaning Saturday, not Sunday, emphasizing personal hygiene and washing. The Nazarite Church claims 1 million members. South Africa only has 35 or 40 million people. They are on the ascendancy, making the established churches less and less relevant, quite frankly, in that region.
So is that true today, Jeffrey, or when you were there?
When I was there, there was clearly more energy coming from the AICs, and there was resentment then and fear among the established churches. And I think I mentioned to you that my headmaster did not appreciate the fact that I was hanging out with the AICs. Like, you're a missionary, you of all people should not be going to those churches. And then in one phrase, he just completely dismissed them by saying they worship under trees.
Trees?
Very pejorative. But he did not, he also didn't want me bringing Catholic priests to the mission station. It was like, if the Catholic students want a mass, they should have gone to a Catholic mission school. This is a UCCZ mission school. You're to minister to UCCZ students. Anyway, I had a lot of fun and games with that. Last thing Philip Jenkins says is the worship of one West African group, the Mosama Disco Cristo Church. I want to know what that church is about. And that church is cited frequently by Jenkins in his book, and is centered upon its temple, the capital T. On only one day a year may the high priest enter its holy of holies. Very much like what scholars believe happened in Hebrew Bible. So this is our devotion time. One of the churches I went to, and I didn't have any still pictures of it, was this church called the International Apostolic Ejuel Jenkinesian Church. I remember this church well because of that name, Jenkinesian. Often the prophet would just yell out, Jenkinesian, and people would respond, Jenkinesian. And I turned to my student, I said, what is that? And he said, it's a prayer word, sort of something from the Old Testament. I said, okay, say so. That's why I remember that I went to this church. I didn't go to the church in Mozambique. I went to the church by our mission station. Welcome, Andrew. But just to give you an idea of the geography here, if you're map people, this is Beira, Mozambique, where this clip was taken from. I lived right here next to Xpungabeira. Xpungabeira is the little village in Mozambique that Mount Selinda is next to. I went there frequently to their market. No passport needed, just walk across, say hello to the border guards and just walk on by. So this is where Mount Selinda is. This is where the work of the United Church of Christ in Zimbabwe was, in the southeastern part of Zimbabwe. The people of central Mozambique are also endowed people, same language, same culture. Just an international border was created in the 1860s in Berlin Germany, you get this, in France, you get this, in Belgium, you get this.
Jeffrey, could you try using your arrow? Because I don't think the other people could see you when you're up there pointing.
Oh,
Can you use your arrow?
yeah, can I?
Can.
There you go.
That's a good question. My cursor,
So there, now I think the people,
that's Beira.
Yeah.
Mozambique. And that's where Joshua, my friend, lived and passed away last week. Over here is the border area between Mozambique and Zimbabwe, where I live. Okay, this is the students, this is the church where Solomon and Willis introduced me to. And I'd just like you to immerse yourself in this worship experience. Try not to examine it so much with your head, but enter into it.
É comigo?
That's from March, March of 2017.
Jeffrey, what do you know about the clothing, the attire that they wear?
Not much. So I began last week with emphasizing what I hope is humility about not knowing all the details. But
Would they?
clothing like this is common to all the independent churches. And it somehow harkens back to imagined Old Testament practices.
I was thinking whirling is it whirling jerks? And then the idea that Honda's music, when I would go to, well, I don't know, I picture myself in some church in Evanston up in a balcony, listening to Honda and getting woozy. You know, the music after, it's sort of like, because it's so repetitive and so banging in your ears and your vestigial system gets a little bit mixed up. So I don't know.
Well, music is physical, right?
Mhm.
You feel it in your bones.
Yes,
Like a heartbeat.
And not just, yeah, it's not just intellectual,
yes.
and it's not just spiritual in terms of, having feelings and whatever. It's
Yeah, right.
embodied,
And then you go way out and your brain leaves.
right? So a lot of spiritual practices are much more embodied than your typical Methodist congregation.
I lost the context here. Is this a special event, or is this every Sunday, or is this every Thursday or Saturday? What was the event?
I don't know. My experience is this is what you would find on any given Saturday. Many times repeated by different churches like this, all throughout southeastern Zimbabwe and probably all throughout Africa.
What is the weekly worship?
Weekly service.
I don't know. Yeah, again, humility, I don't know. Yeah,
Mostly young people, or all young.
well,
Well, they looked all young.
they were acting young. Yes, Eleanor?
Yeah,
I didn't see
when
anybody
you were
old.
attending services on Saturday.
Yeah.
your, Students. So was there mostly just dancing, or were there spoken times, were there joint prayers, what else?
Yeah,
was there besides
there's-
dancing?
There's many things going on. Thank you. That's a great question. There's preaching. And preaching. And remember I mentioned I was asked to preach one day, which was a great honor. And I remember preaching on grace because it was my general impression that grace was not emphasized a lot in these churches. Maybe that's unfair. I don't know. My impression that rules were emphasized and not so much grace. So I remember preaching on grace. And they listened attentively and were gracious, just offering me the opportunity. And I hope it also built some goodwill between someone who's a descendant of the founders of the church that today is in competition with them. Another thing that always happens at these churches is healing. And I didn't have clips. I didn't have time to put a clip in among other clips today, but typically there won't be as many people as you saw here, but there will be circumambulating in counterclockwise direction. And in the center, the prophet will be healing someone. Through prayer, through laying on of hands, sometimes with the gentle application of a stick or something. It's not beating, but it's a symbolic kind of running the devil, the demons out of the person, the demons of illness and sickness. Does this sound familiar? Does it happen in the New Testament? Did Jesus heal people? So this, again, there's very close continuity between pre-Christian African traditional religion and post-Christian. And that type, there's got to be healing. There's got to be healing. There are some wonderful clips on the internet about that you could look up. I actually saw one special faith healer that had been invited to an AIC near Chicory Mission. And he was a special prophet, I guess. And I saw his techniques and they were kind of gross, but I don't know if I should describe them. He would actually put his fingers into someone's mouth until the person vomited. There, I just said it. And that was also a way of extending healing. The point being, though, these churches speak very specifically, directly to the very deep need of African culture to institute healing in a way that they understand, rather than going to a doctor and getting a pill, which is different. And again, the government of Zimbabwe, mainline churches, and even the independent churches encourage both means of healing today. Both Western medicine and traditional medicine are embraced. So if you go to a Nanga, a traditional healer in Zimbabwe, that Nanga is supposed to always refer the patient. After treating them, Nanga is supposed to refer them to the mission hospital. And vice versa. If a patient comes to the mission hospital and also wants to see a Nanga, then the mission hospital staff is to encourage both means of healing.
So the faith healers don't look down on traditional science, they just like to do both.
Right.
Oh, fantastic.
But the faith healing in a church combines both, is my point.
Jim, when you speak with your hand like that, could you stop sharing your screen? Because the people out there
Well-
can't see you do this. And part of your hand waving is actually
Thank you.
50 or 80% of what you're saying.
I'm part Italian,
Well,
but I need to move on.
Yeah.
So, and if I stop sharing my screen, then I have to spend time figuring out how to do it.
And I just interject.
Yes, JS?
I've been in my wanderings through different cultures and methods of spirituality, have come across two different situations where not connected to Africa at all, where it's considered essential for the spirit to do the best it can to heal. There needs to be a physical letting go, and very often that takes the form of vomiting. And it's the part of the body, it's considered part of the body's efforts to rid itself of imprints that are part of the DNA or cellular structure that are not in the person's highest interest.
The 1986 Book of Worship of the United Church of Christ USA includes a healing service. I think people need healing, and people know that healing is always holistic. It's spiritual, it's mental, it's relational, and it's physical. I mean, the psychosomatic unity of the human person is acknowledged today in all forms of medicine. If it's not, I mean, your doctor's missing something. If the doctor's only saying, here's your pill, go home. And there's no warmth, there's no empathy, there's no kindness extended. That part is part of the healing process. In Caring Calling, we say how important the visit is. Listening ears, kindness, love, compassion, reaching out. So Africans know this, like they don't need, they just know it intuitively. So last week we talked about, one more point about Eleanor's question, what else happens in these services? There are sacraments, communion and baptism. Enos Daniel is really the expert on this, as far as I know, on all of this. He was born on a Dutch Reformed mission station in Zimbabwe and grew up with an appreciation for African independent churches. I'm sure his parents didn't approve, but he had this affinity with the independent churches, and this became his life's work. And he spends half the year in Boston at the BU School of Theology, Center for Global Christianity and Mission, and half the year in Zimbabwe, where he continues his research. Again, witchcraft and healing are very important in these churches, and they do it Whereas the established churches, and Enos Daniel will say, the established churches just have a benign, neutral, don't ask, don't tell policy about faith healing, witchcraft, ancestor veneration, and exorcistic healing. African independent churches embraced it full on. Said, yes, if it was good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for us. Did Jesus do this stuff? Did he cast out demons? I mean, is that the story? I appreciate you. Okay, I really need to get to these snips. So this is the Enos Daniel talking about this.
To anybody who comes from outside into this religion of Africa, it is so alive, it is so focused on people with specific problems, and those problems are seen in African light, particularly witchcraft as very destructive of life. White missionaries would tell them, but there is no witchcraft, really, not really. But it was a threat to them which was very real. So this is the kind of setting that people find themselves in, and that is why it's so important that these people, even though they themselves very often do not have a solution that one would like to see, nonetheless, the human factor and the compassion and caring for the people worth more than knowing everything and sorting them out in the Western sense of the word, very often is not a solution. Bishop Nyasha was one in a row of prophets. They all designed something different from the other prophets doing the same thing, so that their practice has its own identity, and that's a prophet praying for the people who are going to file through. Some of them are suspect witches, to confess their sins. So the saviorhood that is acted out comes to expression very strongly at the baptismal ceremony. And what you see with Bishop Nyasha is he is throwing with water, cleansing the people who are confessing their sins. This person here has been accused of witchcraft practices. And then in that process and in the excitement, the spirit that is inducing her to commit witchcraft. And now she's fighting because that spirit comes out in her, and a large number of people are busy keeping them down, and then they get pushed into the water, and the fighting goes on inside the water, and you can see how the people resist. And then when you see that tension breaking and them coming out with beautiful, laughing, happy faces, sometimes crying still because of the emotion, and they're tied with holy cords to prevent their dresses from coming up and in the water. And then there you have, at that picture, you have the white cloth that goes over the people that are baptized. That is the manifestation of the new life that they're entering as they come out on the other side, from the old world into the new. But when you talk witchcraft, it's a very rich subject. And I have seen some of the churches helping the self-confessed witches to achieve new positions in society. They were encouraged by the prophets to participate in local politics, and they would be on the chief's council. And so they rebuilt their social positions until people would realize that they are definitely no longer practicing, even if they, in their own minds, were convinced that they were witches, they have now completely transformed their lives in society. The message of Christianity in this form reaches deeper than the missionaries who are obviously concerned with a lot of other things. They reach a lot deeper in the life and ideas of and the philosophies of the people that they're dealing with. And that is their strength. That's why millions of people are today in the AICs.
So I hope that, I mean, he just summed up why this is an interesting topic. These churches speak to the people. How deep does witchcraft and the belief in witchcraft run? It runs very deep among the people I serve. Here's a story. I went on vacation once in Zimbabwe, a lot of times, and I went to the bank to get cash. I got lots of cash. The headmaster I had mentioned to you before, Mr. Chiogwana Malambo, I had many interesting conversations with. He was in the bank at the same time. Mr. Chiogwana Malambo was Mr. UCCZ, UCC Established Missionary Church, right? He was educated in the UK. He came up to me and said, Reverend Phillips, you need to be careful with all that cash. There are people around us all the time who are able to cast a spell on you. And for a moment, you won't be conscious, and they'll take your cash, and then they'll wake you up from your spell, and your money will be gone. This is somebody who was raised by the missionaries, who did not teach him that. He was taught by his culture. And you can be Western educated, you can be a headmaster of a church-related school, and still that's the belief. So I had a lot of students who would come to me with
What happened?
I got the cash. So one of the questions was, why are you white people not, oh, Andrew would like to say something. Why are you white people not, why do you not believe in witchcraft when it's so obviously present? Why do you white people not, why are you apparently protected from this? And sometimes they just say, I don't understand. I just don't understand. I guess it's just, they didn't say culture. For them, it's not culture, it's reality. So a church that speaks to it directly, like Ina says, is going to be, in the long run, far more successful than the missionary established churches. Yes, and Andrew, go ahead and unmute yourself with your comment question.
It's very interesting. And that's the problem we have, those of us who have the opportunity to be educated and living abroad and learning of the concepts and things the way it is here. So when you go back home and you see somebody and you are trying to correct them of something that somebody is using based on that, a minister would tell you that somebody is planning to kill you, and they've seen it in spiritual realm, and you in order to do that for you, they tell you, they put some kind of fear in you. I have to do such and such for you, and everything costs money. And I'm telling you, what makes you so special that you see that I don't see? Then there you go again. You're a social attack. You think you know it all. So it's a big problem. There is an issue going on right now. A woman, very popular in Ghana, claimed to have some powers to double money. First of all, the currency is supposed to be controlled by the government. So where do you get money to give to people? And had people bring money to them saying that she's going to double their money for them. And then after she got the money, she just walked away. Now they are taking her to court. I mean, it makes no sense to me. But for the government to even get involved with this, but that has been some kind of culture that is inbuilt in their system and in their character. You cannot change it. So it's very difficult. Everything something that we here will attribute to science, like a disease or something, a birth deformity that can be easily attributed to science, a deficiency and stuff like that. You cannot tell them that. They always attribute it to a witch doing.
Yeah,
And
so
that is it. Mhm.
go ahead, you can finish, please.
I'm saying that's across Africa, not just
Yeah.
Ghana. Mhm.
Right, great, great. Yeah, Lynn?
Our older daughter spent a lot of time in Africa, and she worked for a World Bank legal program in Sierra Leone for a while. And she was assigned a case of a young girl, 10 years old, expelled from school because she was accused of being a witch. And the school would not let her back in, and this legal program really wanted to take this case and attempt to. And the people in the school were just convinced because the other students said, sort of like the Salem witch trials, this girl is a witch. And she ended up having to try to get her moved to a different state where she could go to schools.
So the emphasis of Ines Daniel's clip there was that the AICs offer a way out, not only to the expelling of the nature of witchcraft, but also restoring that individual to the community. That was the emphasis at the end. Is this what Jesus did, right? Jesus would say, your sins are healed. You are healed, you're forgiven. Now go show yourself to the priest as a way of restoring that person to the community of faith. So the AICs deal with it directly, whereas the missionary churches would say, witchcraft, what witchcraft? It doesn't really exist.
Our daughter was working from a Western point.
Right.
The legal program, a Western approach to.
Yeah. I'd like to race ahead if I can to my conclusion and then see, hope there's some time for some more comments here. I have a lot more clips, but this PowerPoint is available on the newsletter and also in the spiritual enrichment updates. There we go, get out of there. Pause it and go back to the PowerPoint. So Ines Daniel, through the Boston University School of Theology, has a lot of these 4 or 5 minute clips. This one is on confession and the importance of confession in these churches, communion.
African spirituality, as it is a dynamic expression of God. It is not just.
Why that happened? And that's the wrong slide. Yeah. So communion. And then he has this kind of general introduction, spiritual gatherings. This is, he talks about a 17-day long spiritual gathering, 17-day of one of the Zionist churches. Wow. Basic information to close with. Maybe it's better to begin with basic information. There are tens of thousands of AICs in Africa with more than 83 million members. They are found in every country in sub-Saharan Africa. The ones in Southern Africa tend to be more well-studied, especially by Ines Daniel. Here's an example of one, though, that's not in Southern Africa. The Church of Jesus Christ on Earth by his special envoy, Simon Kimbangu. That's the name of the church. Started in 1921 in the Congo. Today, there are 6 million members of this church. The prophet always has an elevated status in these churches. Sort of semi-divine or quasi-divine. Kimbangu's birthday is now celebrated as Christmas. May 25th. And this is just a lovely picture from above. Looks like a drone picture or something from Congo in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. No time to really talk about this, but the first paragraph is worthwhile looking at. The AICs represent a place to feel at home. That's the point. Western missionaries were largely negative about African culture. and Africans were alienated from the gospel dressed in European garb. To that extent, the AICs represent an indigenizing movement in Christianity. They in effect protest the verbal and cerebral mode, which puts Western Christianity beyond the reach of people's comprehension and experience. It's also been described that Western churches are highly influenced by the Enlightenment, which never reached Africa. And I'm not saying the Enlightenment is a bad thing, but it does tend to put us in our heads with reason and rationality and so on, philosophy, which does not speak to the immediate pastoral needs of people all the time. And the visceral need to stand up and shout and dance and play a drum and be healed. Embodied faith. And he makes this point in the middle of that first paragraph. The AICs offer a celebrative religion, making considerable use of symbols, music, and dance. Thus, they represent cultural renaissance in reaction to the cultural imperialism of the mission work of the historic churches. That is the summary statement of these 2 weeks. The mission stations tried to repress African culture. And the African independent churches embrace it openly, fully, always making contact with the gospel, the Hebrew Bible, and the New Testament. Here's a quick question. Lois Eve raised this question last week. Are AICs ecumenical? They are somewhat ecumenical in relationship with each other. They are largely shut out of the missionary established ecumenical organizations in Africa. That is, each country has its own council of churches. There's also an All Africa Conference of Churches meeting I attended in Harare in 1992. There were no representatives of AICs. They were all Methodists, Anglicans, Episcopal, Baptists, and so on. So in Zimbabwe, this last paragraph says that they have tried to form their own organization. It's called Famizano, sort of organization of Shona churches. And there is in Africa one African-wide organization of AICs. It's based out of Cairo, and they are an observer at the World Council of Churches in Geneva. So how did we do these couple of weeks? Our goal here was to make a contrast between the missionary churches and the AICs, to perhaps help you see how AICs in their own way are authentic Christian churches. Authentic doesn't mean better, worse, but it can mean different in its own cultural context. An appreciation for this concept of enculturation we talked about last week, that if a religion doesn't enculturate itself, it's not going to survive. And a consideration, perhaps you can take this home with you. How does Christianity need to enculturate itself in our culture today? As more and more people just aren't interested in the established churches. Is that a fair statement? Think about your own adult children. Are they racing to church every Sunday morning to be part of a church like ours? If not, then how does Christianity adapt itself yet again, as it's done for 2,000 years in every continent, with every group? How does it adapt itself to unchurched people in our own culture? I've got 6 other questions you can look at on the website. So that's our trip through African indigenous churches. You have a quick comment or question, and then we got to go.
Well, and another thought too.
No quick ones.
This is repeated on other continents too. I visited Christian churches in Thailand and India. They incorporate elements of Thai and Indian culture. Don't have time to go into it. And of course in South America, Central America, Mexico. One closing comment. Lynn, yes?
Quickly, back in high school, I went to a Christian school and we had a missionary come speak to us. We talked about it, as I listen now, the indigenous churches. They basically said they were of the devil because of their playing of drums, their dancing, all of those things that were not approved by
Yep.
Established American Western Church.
Yep. So this tension still exists. And again, my headmaster said, they worship under trees. And I told you last week about how the issue of my students playing drums, dancing, singing hot choruses, not hymns, and worshiping all night. This kept coming up, kept coming up. Where did it come from? It just came from their culture. And the headmaster said, nope, 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 maybe this, not that.